How you doing? My name is Vince Faney. I am the creator and host of Insanity Unplugged. I'm trying my first experiment with podcasts. My technicians and my engineers have gone home. So I'm just fiddling around. Basically like to talk about employment and wages. And the reason why I want to talk about employment and wages is because a lot of people say we're wage slaves, are we? Okay, what makes a wage slave? A lot of people think that minimum wage, you're a wage slave. A lot of people just say, well, even, you got to make a living wage before you're not a wage slave. Bottom line, I kind of have a hard time thinking about getting wages and still being a slave. Slaves don't get wages. You could argue that you're underpaid for the type of work that you do, but even then that gets kind of like, it depends. For instance, back in the day when you used to have minimal amount of people, a certain skill set in an industry, they could command $30-some an hour. And people have this feeling that if I could command $30 an hour back in the 80s, then I should command much more than that now. And then they get ticked off when they can't even command the $30-some an hour. Now back in the day, a person like myself, for personal training, could command, say, $100 an hour. But now we got so many people coming out that it makes it harder for me to justify charging $60 to $100 an hour. I mean, even though I'm worth it, and I can explain why, it's a harder sell. Why? Because you have a lot of people out there who have gotten their certification online or from the back of a comic book or whatever, say that they're personal trainers. So then not only is there a glut of people who set themselves up personal trainers, it takes a while before somebody's reputation can precede them, that this person is the personal trainer of personal trainers. So that's just the way it is. When you have so many people who are in the same field of expertise, they're not going to be able to command the high wages they want. That's just the way it is. I would love to charge $100 an hour and call my shots and everything all the time, but that's becoming harder to do, and that's okay. Anyways, I never looked. I looked at every job I ever owned, and prior to the working for the post office, I got paid minimum wage at best. If I worked on my own and went out to shovel people's snow, wash their cars, carry the paper, do whatever, we didn't get minimum wage. Waitresses didn't used to get minimum wage. They had to factor in what the government thought their tips should be. Okay? My parents, who were sharecroppers, my parents' parents, and relatives who were sharecroppers, my mother's sisters, brothers, and so forth and so on, they worked from sun up to sundown. They didn't get paid until the crops came in, and it was risky because some years they didn't get anything. They lost money. So I never thought of as a wage slave. I was obviously, when you're living from hand to mouth and you're getting paid minimum wage and you're living in a place that's not that nice, in a neighborhood that's pretty sketchy, you want more. But a lot of people don't know how to get more. I never once thought, what is the rich doing for us? I used to crap what's the government doing, of course, because I didn't understand things, but so I didn't have the attitude that I'm a wage slave. Now I found out once I got a job at the post office, 5 weeks paid vacation a year, 4 paid sick leave. We had all sorts of perks. And so it was weird how the people who thought they were wage slaves when they got paid minimum wage prior to the post office and then getting at the post office, the next thing you know, they were, the union had them convinced after a couple of years, a lot of these people thought they were wage slaves, or not so much wage slaves, but working in brutal salt mine-like conditions. So we could basically perceive, we could complain no matter how good we have it. So the whole thing about government, that's another thing about government. A lot of people think that the private sector should be making more money, because when they look into the government workers, the teachers and so forth, they'll say, look at this, they got PERS, they're going to be making more money on retirement than when they were working. That's the way it should be. And government workers, look how much they make. And I got to tell you something, that's upside down. I've worked for the government. I've worked in the private sector. No doubt, if you're a secretary and you work in the private sector, you're making $5 an hour, and then you go into a government job, and as a secretary with no more skills or anything else, you're making $15 an hour. Who wouldn't be happy? But is that really healthy for our economy? Because what pays the government salaries? What pays the money that runs these government agencies? It comes from the private sector, and the private sector, it has to make more money than the people working comparable jobs in the government sector. It just really has to be that way. Otherwise, it's upside down, inside out. It's a Ponzi scheme doomed to failure. Back when I get a job, or especially before I got a job with the Postal Service, when I first got a job, it wasn't like the high wages that it became back in this, the 80s and so forth, 90s. When a person went to get a government job, it was because they were tired of going out into the private sector looking for a job that would meet their skills and would be guaranteed. They got tired of being laid off. They got tired of hunting for a job. A lot of times somebody had a job in the private sector, but they were afraid of the uncertainty, of the instability. The private sector, by its very nature, is unstable. Companies grow, they get stronger, they get bigger, they get richer, then they diminish. Another company rises up in its place. So that's why if you got a secretary job, you make $15. It should be, let's say you make $15 an hour in a company out in the private sector. If you wanted stability, you go into the government sector, and you were happy to get half that much because you knew that you had a job for life. You had a pension, you had health benefits, you had all sorts of perks that you wouldn't have in the private sector. You just made less per hour. It's turned flip-flop, which is unhealthy for the economy, quite frankly. Now, you look at a lot of people in the government sector, and except for people who have jobs in the government sector where they're actually like STEM jobs, science, technology, engineering, electrical, computers, mechanical, something like that, something that's real sciencey, mathematical. Most people, their jobs really are the skill. They require some thought. I don't want to say it's brainless jobs, but unless you're doing something in the sciences, the jobs in the government sector, by my estimation, and I got friends and relatives who work at so many different agencies and so forth, and they'll say the same, is that it's not that hard. It doesn't require a college education for most of the jobs in the government sector. Again, most of the jobs that are in the sciences and the maths and so forth, the engineering jobs in the government sector, back in the day, even if they weren't getting paid as much as they would in the private sector, they had secure jobs. Engineers or anybody working in the government sector is getting paid more money than a good, competent engineer in the private sector. Unless it's the engineer that works for one of the military industrial complexes or a business that is where their products and services are really in demand. Like, for instance, a computer software engineer, when they first started working in Silicon Valley, during the boom in Silicon Valley, there's no way they were going to get that good of a job making that much money in Silicon Valley, in the government. Of course, the government wouldn't even think of them working 100 and some hours a week. In the private sector, many of these guys would, for their bosses, work 80, 90, 100 hours a week to meet the crunch, and also to get the perks and the bonuses. So, government is very wasteful. And I just want to say this. You got a lot of people who are crying about the rich, and they want the rich to have the compassion, the love, the generosity, and so forth that they themselves can't present themselves or demonstrate themselves. It's kind of sad. They think of the rich as getting there like somehow it was a privilege. They only got it. There was no merit to people getting rich. Now, you have a certain percentage of people who inherit their wealth, and I don't see anything wrong with that. If and people think that people shouldn't be allowed to inherit their wealth, blah blah blah. Well, come on, any one of you who are raising your children, some of you are thinking about putting your kids through college and helping them to have a better life than you. And if you could engineer it, you would like to have them inherit some money, maybe a house or something. Now, for me to say that's not fair, I should be able to take your son's house and your daughter's 401k because they inherited, they didn't earn it. That's not right. So that's why I'm not against the rich providing for their children or people inheriting wealth. In fact, there's only a third of the people out there inherit their wealth. Most of the people out there work long, hard work and study long, hard hours all through school, through college, through grad school, and then they go through years of brutal competition and work, competing with other people who've been to college like them to get the big CEO jobs or the big executive jobs or the engineering jobs or R&D and so forth. And it's very competitive, and they put in long hours. They don't just like work 40 hours a week, collect big money. The CEO of Apple, he's one of the richest people in the world, but I wouldn't want that kind of money because of the amount of hours and sacrifice he's had to make to get it. Now, of course, the shareholders voted him in, decided he needed that kind of money. It was the choice of the market. A lot of people think that he ripped everybody off and pulled the fast one. The only reason why he got that job as CEO to make that kind of money, he had a reputation that preceded him, and the shareholders decided to keep him. They wanted him. They thought that they would make more money, the company would be healthier, more vigorous, more products and services would bring in more revenue for the GNP of the nation and also for their company, and shareholders would be happy and everybody would be happy. So it's not like he stole that. People need to understand that. People don't like shareholders. They think that should be against the law. But unfortunately, shareholders, without them, they're investing in a company. A lot of businesses wouldn't make it without shareholders. Shareholders want a return on their money for investing in the company. That's not like they're just, there's a give and take. People think, oh, well, the shareholders put too much pressure on the corporations to be greedy. Well, there is pressure for the corporations to do better. And yes, the name of the game is to make as much money as possible without, of course, committing theft, fraud, murder, and destroying utter destruction of the environment and following certain government regulations. So, why do the people want to make more money for their shares? Because more people will become excited because by the products, more product innovation and so forth and so on, or hopefully. And plus, people buy stocks because that's their way of making money for their future, for their retirement, for their kids' college fund, for their disability insurance, for their long-term care, for their nursing home, for their medical, and for that trip to the Bahamas that they've been putting off for 20 years and want to have. So essentially, you're just saying, I want to have a secure financial relationship, but nobody who buys stocks and bonds should have that. That's just immoral. And I think that kind of thinking is stupid and illogical and unethical. Now, most people who do that initially just haven't thought it through, aren't stupid or illogical or unethical. They just haven't thought it through. But I've met people who get the look in their eyes that they understand what you're saying, that yes, this is good, but they won't say that. They double down, and they just think that people who want money are evil. Now, like in real estate, to get money in real estate, to invest things, a lot of people are pissed off at landlords who are like giving them 30-day notices and so forth and so on. But the fact is, for no cause and raising rents. But they forget that most landlords are people who've won maybe a handful of rentals. They got those rentals, they earned them from working hundreds and hundreds and thousands of hours besides their regular workaday job, spending years giving up and not indulging in material things or indulgences, working long and hard, losing money on those properties some years, barely making anything other years, and dealing with all sorts of crap, and we're talking about just basically a lot of risk. So eventually when the market allows them, they raise the rents. Now, a lot of people think, I don't care. Basically what it is, they don't care what that person's going through. Those troubles are the landlords. All they know is, I just moved in, I've been here for a year, you've raised the rent $400. Well, really, that's that person's right to do that, right? If I have a car and I want to raise and I want to lease it to you and I want to raise a couple $100s a month, that should be my right. And you have a right to go elsewhere. The problem with real estate, though, and I understand real estate more than any other product or service, is the fact is that there's a limited inventory of places for people to live. But that's more of a government. That the government kind of has to play a big hand in that too. The market and the government, right? Because government won't allow the city boundaries to extend a lot of times. They won't allow buildings to go over a certain height, so you can't create buildings that house more people going up. They often will put restrictions on people with big enough lots to put a grandmother's house or apartment out there. And if they do, allow people to rezone for taller buildings, extra units and so forth. The permits and fees are so egregious that only a handful of very wealthy people or a big group of people syndicating can afford those sort of ventures. So basically, it's that government kind of decisions is allowing, almost demanding, almost purposely stimulating an environment where only rich people are going to do well with that situation. So the fact is, though, regardless of how terrible things are and the limited inventory, this new law to control rent is really what grieves me. Even though it's helped a few people and some people feel better, finally we got control over the landlords. Some people are going to be able to benefit. Some people will, some tenants. Some landlords, it won't hurt them. In fact, the small time, the bigger the syndication and the bigger the property ownership group, the less they're going to be harmed, because they're the ones calling the shots and putting pressures on the legislators and ones giving campaign funding and so forth. So they could survive. Things are engineered and framed by law for the most populated portion of the market, of the owners, to be able to step around stuff. The people who are going to have the worst problem are the people who 1 to 4 rentals, who maybe are holding on by the skin of their teeth of a minimum wage job. Maybe they don't even have a job, and they're looking at all these hard years of taking risk, working hard to get into these buildings, and also basically thousands of hours and all the time, years of losing money, just like my sharecropper relatives, but want to basically kind of recoup because the market will allow them. To have the government and other people just take that away is pretty brutal. And I've heard a lot of people say, well, if they didn't plan for failure, then they should not have planned to get a business. They had no business going into business. And I want to turn that around and say to people who are without means to come and go as they please, if you didn't plan for life to do the best thing that you could do in life, then maybe some would argue you shouldn't even be allowed to live. I wouldn't argue that, but I would say, you don't deserve all these rights if you didn't plan for the worst case scenario. So the thing is, when it comes to you have a better chance of planning your life, more control over you than controlling everything else outside of you. And the people who go to invest aren't just planning only their life personally. They have to deal with so many other moving parts. It's not easy for any of us. That said, we just have to move forward. So when it comes to government waste, a lot of people, since the Johnson administration and his war against poverty, he's had just the government agencies alone, just to give you an idea of the kind of waste that government has. You have the welfare department. You have housing department, subsidized housing for the poor. You have the food stamps, and other things dealing with children to help people raise their children who are poor. So you have these handful of agencies that are dedicated to people who are poor or homeless, right? Mainly poor, okay? Whether these are people with limited incomes who are older, single mothers with no husband around, you get the picture. Since 1964 to 2014, $20-some trillion have been spent on helping the poor, to alleviate the poor. Guess what? We got more poor with us. Did it help some people get out of poverty or survive why they found themselves out of poverty? Yes, it did. The majority of people, it just allowed them to survive, which is not a bad thing. Allowing people to survive, for God's sakes, eat, have housing, and so forth. But here's the problem. Despite all this, the money was so mismanaged that we have more poor than ever, and $20-some trillion that if we were to act fast today, that would pay today. We'd have to do it soon because the debt is building up exponentially, and then even this money wouldn't even pay the interest, but we'd be able to pay off the national debt. Okay, but forget about even the debt. Just take that 20-some trillion dollars. If you were to take all the people from 1964 to now that have died during that time, and then you would magically also take all the people within my generation or today that are still alive, and that have been alive during that time, still alive, and you were to figure out how many of these people are heads of the household, you would be able, with that money, give each of those people a house, or at least $100,000, $200,000, because back then houses were $100,000, $20-some thousand, whatever. Every person who was a head of a household, and sometimes it'd be a married couple, sometimes a single mother, single father, head of the household, or even a single person who owns their own house, or is an adult that rents their own house. You have every adult would have a house, and money for the house, money that would have paid for the college and some other perks. What has government done with all that money? Now, of course, they had to pay wages. They had to pay wages to people. Now remember, they got the money from people who are making less money than the government workers. So people who are making less are getting taxed so people in government can make more. Government doesn't produce anything. Government just simply squanders and wastes and is disorganized. We could have done this for each other with none of the waste. Now, a lot of people want to piss off at the poor, the rich, the top 2%. They said we got to get rid of the top 2%. They're the ones that cause all our problems. They're the greediest ones. Well, you know, to get into the top 2%, you got to make 300 and some thousand to get into that threshold to be in the top 2%. Now, here's the problem. Majority of the people who are making 300, 400,000, 500,000, whatever, majority of those people won't be making that. They didn't make that prior to this year. If they're in that category this year, they won't be in there next year, may never be in that category again. It goes up and down. You look at the top in Search of Excellence, all the top companies when the book first came out, almost none of them exist anymore. Businesses and wealth goes up and down. It moves around. And the fact of the matter is, only the top 0.01% were responsible for the banking collapse or the Wall Street debacle. And what did our government do? We gave them money, our money. They forced us to bail the companies out that were trying to screw us. And the reason why some of these companies could do it is it was a bipartisan effort to get rid of the Glass-Steagall Act and also implement some other lending policies that would allow money to be lended to people who could not afford to pay the loans. They were high-risk loans. They were adjustable rate mortgages, or adjustable rate interest and so forth. So it was almost planned to fail, even though they said they were too big to fail. We bailed them out. The money we used to bail them out, we could have houses with that money. Forget about that 20-some trillion that the other agency spent. We took the money that Obama and Bush and all these guys gave them, and the money they waste. We could have free housing, and we could have college and all that. I'm not saying that's necessarily the best and healthiest thing to do, that everybody should have free housing and free college and universal income. I'm not so sure. I'm not dead set against it. I just don't necessarily believe it's the healthiest for spiritual and emotional and whatever growth of a human being. But just want to put it out there, that's money that we paid these guys to go on junkets that we could have gave each other without going through a government agency to help each other have real estate and have a place to live. Just saying. Okay? So we look at the top 0.01%, they're the cause of it. And a lot of people are still pissed off at the rich, the top 2. Let's go for the top 2. I'm part of the 99. And I try to explain to this person, the heck with it. Let's go after the top 10%, because they'll say, well, the top 10% owns 50% of the wealth. Well, if you look at the top 10% of the wealthiest people in the world, because we only have 300 million people, give or take a couple million, but the top percentage of people in the world, if you take that percentage, most of those wealthy people are not in the United States. Or if they are in the United States, they're multinational, they have residences elsewhere. But let's forget about the people that live here, who also reside other places and so forth. Look at the Chinese. Look at the Russians. The Chinese and Russians, the Pakistanis and the Indians, are the fastest populations that is growing the fastest a group of millionaires and billionaires in the world far outstrip the United States. These are the people who are the top 10%, right? These are the people who, if you take the top 10%, let's just say the top 10% of in the United States. Okay, so that's 30. That's 30. Was it 30,000 people? Okay, 30,000 people own, I think, at 10% of 300 million, that would be 30 million. 30 million people own 50% of the United States, allegedly. Okay, and I looked into the IRS and some other data sites, and if you were to decide, we're tired, the heck with this, forget about taxing them, because people talk about, well, during the Eisenhower years, people were taxed 10%, or no, 70%, 90%. Fact is, that's what they were required to pay for some period of time. They were required to pay 70 to 90% if you made X amount of money over such and such. That was the rule, but none of those guys paid it. Why? Because the government also offers all sorts of tax incentives to shelter that money. And there's some good reasons for that too, because people are always looking to stimulate jobs. Since the government cannot create jobs and needs funding from the private sector, then everybody wants more jobs. People cry for more jobs. The government wants to see more jobs. So they use that money to stimulate the people who know how to make money to stay in the country and to create jobs and so forth. So if you're not gonna pay taxes, you want to get out paying these taxes, invest in another company, invest here, invest there, and that will stimulate job growth. It doesn't always work in the manner that people hope, but without that, if people didn't invest money, if they took their money outside the country like they're starting to do, then we'd be going after the hind tit of a boar. Anyways, so you have that, but now you have the wealthy, and the wealthy is like, I'd say, okay, just for instance, let's say we go after the top 10% and say, we're not going to even tax you. We're going to just take everything you have, make you homeless. We're a mob. We're just going to take everything you have, your properties, your investments, your cars, your bling, everything. We're going to make you homeless. The amount of money we would get would barely, if we acted this week, would barely pay off the national debt. But then we become a third world country overnight, because we just sold the businesses and everything to do that. There'd be no businesses. We'd be worse off than Venezuela. So it's a tough spot to be in, and it's always been tough for people who aren't rich. Always. It's just the nature of things. It's designed that way. The math will not allow for everybody to have exactly the same thing. If you were to disperse, here's the problem, if you were to disperse everything equally, let's say we did that, and we all had a house, a reasonable house. We all had a car. We all had free education. We all had free everything. Well, for one thing, why would there be any need for industry if we all gave each other this stuff? Here we go. For the rest of our life, we have this stuff. Why would anybody need to work if they have their stuff? And the fact of the matter is, a lot of things wouldn't be worth anything if it was that equal across the board. People, in fact, within a couple years, the ratio of people who have and have not would be roughly the same. Because you're always going to have people, no matter how poor you are, how rich you are, you're always going to want something that somebody else has. You want extra. You want more. You want to spend more. You want to have more experiences. You want to do more. So some people just spend more. Some people just want more, and they're willing to do it with work, and while they work less and save less. And then you got other people who are just smarter, and they're more frugal, and they work harder, and they're willing to sacrifice more and invest wiser, and so forth. So the whole thing goes over again. So we got to find some means, and that's not a bad thing, by the way. Let me digress. It's like a forest. You don't want a forest to be farm, like it is in BML land. You don't want just one or two species of trees and have everything homogeneous. It's not a very rural forest. It's subject to destruction and pestation and so forth. The forest that is the most robust, is the forest that's the most diversified, with so many different species and so forth. And for that to happen, there's a lot of death and destruction, building and decay. So during sometimes, just like in a population of people, where some businesses rise and then they fall, and then other people are here and then they're there, then the business falls and they have to sell off parts, and then people like you and me at our level can now afford to buy things we couldn't afford before because they're being sold pennies to the dollar, and then we get together and we build something else. So it's always revolving, always revolving. And so it's not perfect. Some people fall through the cracks. Some people just, just like in the forest, the salmon that gets caught by the grizzly, it's too bad. That's how it is. But it's overall, it's the healthiest way for any living system to be. But we're human beings, and we're trying to figure out, how do we not be the salmon that gets eaten by the grizzly? How do we not fall through the cracks? And if we fall through the cracks, how do we help to soften the blow for each other and help to uplift each other? And that's not an impossible conundrum, but we got to think about that. And that's why I really believe that we should all be making an effort not to go through government, not to do rent control or price controls or anything, is that we the people can get together, we can syndicate in groups and so forth, and go out and purchase real estate, take it off the inventory, own it outright. There are ways of owning it outright. I showed this method in a blueprint to some of my former postal workers. They didn't want to do it. They were just like, but you can end up owning neighborhoods in a short order, in a generation, and you can charge whatever you want. If I want to buy a smartphone today for $1,000 and sell it for $5 to you today, there's nothing to stop me if I own it outright. We can do that with real estate. So if we get assured that to help each other, not through the government, but through our own efforts and endeavors and sacrifice to help each other to have reasonable accommodation, to where nobody who, unless they want to be, has to be out in the rain and so forth. Then we would have a society where that would be safer to live and people be less stressed. But it will require everybody to get involved in this. And just to give you an example, it's a good idea for each of us to know where everybody's coming from. I've been homeless and I've almost been rich. And a lot of people think that people are homeless, or some mental illness, lazy, criminal record, substance abuse or whatever. And I have some friends that think that, and I say, well, wait a minute, I've been homeless a couple times, and why the first once or twice, especially the first time, was my fault, errors in judgment. I was not lazy. I was working 80 hours a week at a janitorial job. I paid my bills first, then I overspent and partied the rest of it too much, so I wasn't prepared for financial emergencies. And I didn't have substance abuse, even though I partied a lot. I didn't have mental illness, even though people would claim, rightly so, I'm eccentric and kind of an oddball. And I just have a willingness to do any kind of job. So we got to watch how we just put people in slots. The same can be said about rich people. Rich people are not always selfish. They're not, it's not like they don't care for people. They just have a different plan of getting through life. So just think of that. So we just got to get through, and we got to go after the big money. The real mother lode is keeping the government from spending, wasting. So when we want these socialist messiahs to come forth, my thing is they exist now. They're socialists now. They want to help the poor. They will have all these ideas. Dude, gentlemen, ladies, gentlemen, let's think of this. They're already in government. They're in charge of all the appropriations, different appropriations committees. There's nothing keeping them from overseeing the monstrous waste that's going. If you can't get people who have already been ensconced in government to curtail the waste that's there in their backyard, where they could easily manipulate it, if you can't trust them to do that, they're not doing that. Are these really the same people we want to trust for a New Deal, for a socialism? That, and I'm not against, show me a good plan, but don't point to Norway and Scandinavia and say they're the model we want to go after when you're describing a model they don't even follow. Don't be saying I know Cuba didn't make it, and Venezuela didn't make it, and North Korea didn't make it, and all these other countries didn't make it. Our way will be better. Okay, put it on an Excel spreadsheet where we can account for every penny of where it's going to come from, how it's going to come. Spreadsheet. It's got to be, some of us are smart enough to follow an Excel spreadsheet. If you can't show it on a spreadsheet in a way that an average person can understand, then you don't really have a viable plan. You're just tooting your own horn, and you're basically doing the Barnum Bailey shenanigans and just trying to get people who are wishing for unicorns to vote for you, and that's immoral. So, anyways, this has been Vinsanity Unplugged. Have a great weekend.